Living as we do in an age of existential dread, a dread precipitated by media-manufactured pandemics and carefully contrived climate crises, systematic racism, as well as the eminently more plausible prospects of war, economic collapse and technocratic tyranny, it now seems all but undeniable that the turmoil of our times has taken a ruinous toll on our collective mental health. The listener has likely witnessed this deterioration firsthand. When once the reality of psychological illness was confined to the occasional troubled soul seen screaming on a city street corner, today the head-nosable disorders represent the defining feature of entire generations. From the legions of depressed young men retreating into isolation to the outbreak of anxiety afflicting their female counterparts, from transgender delusions and a worsening drug epidemic to the veneration of decadence, degeneracy, and wholesale erasure of moral and ethical standards. Given this society-wide derangement, it is perhaps unsurprising, some would argue commendable, that ever-growing segments of the population are pursuing redress for their psychological ills. As of 2024, more than half of all Gen Z and Millennial Americans admitted to undergoing some form of therapy, while a great many more have sought solace in the sudden proliferation of mindfulness apps, self-help books, and pseudo-spiritual influencers, all of whom encourage adherents, despite their varying New Age veneers, to examine the innermost reaches of the mind, and by extension, the totality of human experience, through a framework first devised by a small but fiercely ambitious group of early 20th century Jewish intellectuals. Although still heralded as one of the crowning achievements of the European Enlightenment, intellectually refined and culturally cosmopolitan, Vienna at the dawn of the 1900s nonetheless faced an uncertain future. Capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, itself a sprawling, multi-ethnic patchwork steadily being eroded by nationalist sentiments, the city, conceivably the most diverse in the continent, churned with apprehension and distrust, as Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, and a dozen other semi-assimilated nationalities lived in increasingly uneasy accord. Economic inequality only heightened these tensions. Between the ornate palaces and gilded opera houses, the tree-lined boulevards and marble-planned coffee houses, the squalor of its slums was seeping rapidly into bourgeois reality. Murmurs of revolution exchanged beneath a skyline still pulsing with imposing imperial authority. This atmosphere, as many literary inhabitants of the time noted, was fundamental in transforming Vienna from a traditionalist stronghold into a petri dish of emerging ideas and new forms of artistic expression. Its musical history is possibly its most renowned. Home to composers such as Brahms, Mahler, and Johann Strauss, and formerly Mozart, Schubert, and Beethoven, so too did the city make enormously outsized contributions to the domains of visual art via the Vienna Secession movement, science and philosophy through Ludwig Wittgenstein and the Vienna Circle, as well as, of course, politics, Trotsky and Hitler having spent some of their most ideologically formative years there. Alongside these developments, however, brewed a far stranger force, a movement rooted not in Greek rationalism or the Roman honor code, but instead its practitioners' mere universal Jewishness. The first meeting of the Wednesday Psychological Society was held in 1902 as an informal gathering of psychiatrists and physicians aimed at systematizing the human mind. Many of the attendees are no doubt familiar to the listener. Among the most noteworthy was Joseph Breuer, whose work effectively laid the groundwork for the formalized study of the subconscious, while of arguably more lasting impact was Alfred Adler, his holistic approach to talk therapy still forming the basis of most modern counselling strategies. Other participants included Otto Rank, the earliest advocate of so-called birth trauma, as well as Melanie Klein, known for her radical object relations theory. Beside them sat the similarly pioneering figures of Victor Tausk and Sandor Feremsky, Heinz Gehut and Wilhelm Stekel, although there was unquestionably one name which towered high above the rest, that of the committee's enigmatic founder and uncontested chairman, Sigmund Freud. Within the general public, and indeed contemporary academic circles, Freud's legacy remains that of a resolutely secular thinker, a man whose unwavering commitment to reason and scientific determinism comprised the bedrock of his studies. Unlike philosophers and mystics before him, the unremarkable neurologist turned father of psychoanalysis felt it possible to view the mind through a strictly empirical lens, regarding the unconscious not as the realm of the abstract non-knowable, but as a substructure of observable, quantifiable, and thus decipherable patterns. It was this conviction, his mythos goes, that compelled Freud to explore even the most controversial, often distasteful aspects of the human psyche: incestuous desires and infantile sexuality, patricide and implicit suicidality, without concern for either societal or ethical norms, much less the era's restrictive religious taboos. "The Jews have celebrated me as a national hero," he wrote towards the end of his life, "although my merit in the Jewish cause is confined to the single point that I have never denied my Judaism." Despite this claim, as well as his prevailing reputation, there is ample evidence that Freud's lineage played a far more central role in his life and ultimately his work than is conventionally acknowledged. Born in the small town of Freiburg, modern-day Pribor, Czechia, the bright but frequently withdrawn child was, if not exactly immersed in the faith, then most certainly imbued with its cultural ethos. Both his grandfather and great-grandfather had been rabbis. At home, Freud's mother exclusively spoke a Galician dialect of Yiddish, the family bookshelves furnished with some of Judaism's most foundational texts. One of these was to prove particularly sentimental, Freud keeping for the remainder of his life the same copy of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which his father Jacob had gifted him on his 35th birthday, the inscription reading not to Sigmund but rather Shlomo, the psychoanalyst's Hebrew name reserved for ceremonial occasions. Several observers have suggested that it was Freud's complex, often antagonistic relationship with his more observant patriarch, as opposed to the extent of any assimilation into Viennese society, that prompted his readiness to obfuscate his Ashkenazi heritage. Most, however, attribute this to his concern that the psychoanalytic movement would be dismissed within the tinderbox of the late Austro-Hungarian Empire as an innately Jewish discipline. Either way, what seems irrefutable is that Freud's ties to his forebears would survive, albeit in a religious form, this early familial friction. When, at 30 years of age, Sigmund at last chose to marry, he did so to a leading in Martha Bernays, the deeply devout granddaughter of Hamburg's chief rabbi. In fact, Freud's mother-in-law was purportedly so puritanical that she refused to accept so much as a drink of water in a non-kosher household, while perhaps more telling still is the couple's second son, Ernest, who, in addition to being a well-respected architect, was also an avowed and vitriolic Zionist, none of Freud's children ever shedding their de facto Judaism despite their allegedly atheistic upbringing. Of course, all this would remain wholly circumstantial, if not for sentiments espoused in his private writings. In a 1931 letter to the chief rabbi of Vienna, the then 75-year-old luminary conceded, "In some place in my soul, in the hidden corner, I am a fanatical Jew," also confessing that he found the attraction of Judaism and of Jews so irresistible, many gawked emotional powers, all the mightier the less they let themselves be grasped in words, as well as the clear consciousness of inner identity, the secrecy of the same mental construction. Throughout his correspondences, especially with his ideological allies, Freud would often allude to his admiration for the Jews, noting their resilience and self-professed intellectual prowess, sometimes venturing to imply, if not categorically state, that fate had bestowed upon his people a special role in the modern world. In his published work, Freud was considerably more circumspect. Indeed, a bulk of his most explicitly philosemitic statements did not see print until his final book, Moses and Monotheism, in which the author offers a psychoanalytic assessment of Judaism's one-God revolution, asserting that it forced upon the people a progress in spirituality which, significant enough in itself, further opened the way to respect for intellectual work and to further instinctual renunciations. In contrast, he depicts Gentile religions as primitive and reliant on sensory idols, suggesting that Christianity, while inheriting the elevating monotheistic traditions of Judaism, had succeeded only in distorting these with resentment and guilt-leaving narratives about the crucifixion, the underlying awareness of their inferiority fueling the intrinsically Gentile trait of anti-Semitism. Pervasive throughout Moses and Monotheism is the impression that Freud's self-imposed exile from Judaism was born not merely of his opinion that all religions stemmed from the same neurosis, but rather a confidence that the doctrine had long ago served its essential function, moulding as it had people of unmatched moral, cultural, and intellectual stature. This flagrant supremacism was demonstrated quite expressly in his personal givings. Behind the closed doors of the study groups, which Freud had since rebranded the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, the analyst was keen to assure his exclusively Jewish discipleship and they shared a natural affinity for the fiend due to their racial kinship. While in conversation with Joseph Wartis, a Brooklyn-born psychiatrist, used Candida Nux to state, "Ruthless egotism is much more common among Gentiles than among Jews. In Jewish family life and intellectual life are on a higher plane." Not even Carl Jung, Freud's most celebrated student, and one of only 2 Goyim admitted to his meetings, ever assuaged these prejudices. Throughout their infamously fractious relationship, Freud remained dubious of his Swiss protege's capacity to fully grasp the intricacies of the mind, be a solely in its Teutonic lineage, while never quite shedding the suspicion that Jung harboured inherited Christian and even anti-Jewish biases. It was Ernest Jones, however, a Welsh psychoanalyst and the discipline's first English-speaking proponent, who bore the brunt of these misgivings. By his own admission, Freud perceived his sycophantic underling with a sense of racial strangeness, whose Celtic ancestry rendered him not quite accessible to the other members of the coterie. At times, this ambivalence would verge on outright abuse. Perhaps the most egregious example of this lay in Freud's habit of ingratiating himself into Jones's romantic life, insisting that he performed psychiatric evaluations on the women his apprentice was involved with, evaluations which invariably led to the dissolution of the courtship. Jones's devotion remained unwavering. Some would say that it is testament to the exclusionary atmosphere generated by Freud, but even his most ardent follower was moved to lament it, Jones bemoaning, in his 3-volume biography of his mentor, the Jewish belief which they often impose on other people too, concerning the superiority of their intellectual powers. But while Freud's Judeo-centrism might have manifested in skepticism, if not outright hostility towards his Gentile students, within his academic writings, this took on a more paternalistic bent. As both beneficiaries and custodians of the Mosaic value system, Jews, he contended, bore the primary responsibility for shepherding mankind toward nobler heights, an attitude further illustrated by his membership of the B'nai B'rith, a semi-secretive Zionist fraternity upholding the children of Israel as moral and intellectual exemplars. Many of his associates shared this quasi-messianic conviction, Franz Alexander commenting that the cultural significance of psychoanalysis lies in helping Western man to find his ego identity. While Otto Rank, a man Freud had lauded as his adopted son, even went as far as to proclaim Jews the healers of humanity. Somewhat predictably, any prospective Gentile redemption could only be achieved, the rabbi maintained, through sweeping sexual liberation. The listener is presumably conversant with Freudian mechanisms such as the Oedipal complex and castration anxiety, penis envy and latent homosexuality, transgressive, even abhorrent suppositions which form the centermost pillars of the early psychoanalytic enterprise. These, it has since been established, were predominantly products of its originator's own inclinations he wrongly extrapolated as a human truism. Yet, so vehemently did Freud cling to his hypotheses that numerous high-ranking members were disbarred for the heresy of having questioned him. Naturally, many were suspicious of his motives. After all, while Freud and his entourage might have affirmed their efforts to be in service of the non-Jewish world, it is not difficult to see how so many within a staunchly conservative Vienna considered their psychosexual crusade to be an assault on Western values, the immorality of Gentile culture something to be pathologized, modified, and eventually overcome. As already stated, and not at all controversially, the most accepted explanation behind Freud's minimization of his Jewish identity was the fear that the movement might be discredited as ethnically oriented. He had every reason to fear this charge. In addition to the racial composition of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, there also existed throughout his work a palpable undercurrent of Judeo-mysticism, the Kabbalah in particular seeming to provide a peephole through which Freud scrutinized the human mind. At the core of his writings, for instance, lies the belief that painfully buried memories and gravely suppressed desires must be brought into conscious understanding in order to facilitate catharsis and healing. But this would not prove a purely personal transformation. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud remarked, "Just as a planet revolves around a central body as well as rotating on its own axis, so the human individual takes part in the course of development of mankind." A passage that hints at the societal and even epical advancements which might arise upon widespread psychological rehabilitation. Correspondingly, the Kabbalah speaks of tikkun olam, or repairing the world, a creed emphasizing the metamorphic power of insight, both for the spiritual well-being of the initiate as well as on the earthly health of the whole. These processes, needless to say, require one to confront their own inner darkness. For Freud, this meant shining a spotlight on the lowliest and most shameful aspects of our character so that we might at last transcend them, a concept mirroring quite unequivocally the Kabbalistic notion of the klipot, the metaphysical husks or shells which separate humanity from its creator. These even exhibit methodological overlap. Writing in the interpretation of dreams, Freud suggests that our nocturnal imaginings are in fact expressions of unacknowledged needs striving to imprint themselves upon our cognitive perception, while in the Kabbalah, these constitute nothing less than messages from the divine. A yet more concrete comparison lies in Freud's most comprehensive theory, the id, the ego, and the superego. In essence, these represent the component parts of one's personality, a blueprint he concocted to articulate the complex interplay of reason, instinct, and morality that aligns near perfectly with the Kabbalah's idea of nefesh, ru'ah, and neshama. Both the id and nefesh, to put it in the simplest possible terms, embody mankind's basest, most brutish urges, while at the more measured end of the spectrum, the superego and neshama act as either, depending on your perspective, one's sublimely inspired moral compass, or the internalized voice of societal and paternal expectations. Between these competing immensities stands the Freudian ego and the Lurianic which attempt to navigate the complexities of daily life, striking a balance between our animal impulses and our higher selves. These are far from the only symmetries. Some scholars, such as David Bakken, have argued that Freud's very conception of the unconscious echoes quite conspicuously the theosophical arrangement of the Sephirot, 10 attributes through which the infinite and eternal interacts with the physical world. Others, like Sanford Drobe, have highlighted commonalities between Tzimtzum, God's diminution, and the therapist's preoccupation with psychological repression, while a yet more pertinent analogy may be found in Eros and Thanatos, his so-called life and death drives, and the Kabbalistic depictions of Chesed and Gevurah. Given the prevalence and indeed the precision of such parallels, it would seem the only matter left for debate is whether Freud had reportedly kept a German translation into Zohar on his desk, drew these deliberately, or whether, in a feat of almost unfathomable irony, he was guided to his conclusions by the dim light of his own subconscious. By virtually all accounts, both those of his contemporaries as well as his many subsequent biographers, Freud commanded a peerless presence within the fledgling psychoanalytic enterprise. Revered as a visionary, feared as an authority, and often resented for his insistence on intellectual orthodoxy, meetings of the Wednesday Psychological Society invariably saw its founder assume, both in the figurative and literal sense, his position at the head of the table, setting the agenda, presiding over discussions, and serving as the final arbiter in debates. Dissent was met with undisguised hostility. Otto Rank, initially one of Freud's closest confidants, would go on to describe the group as hierarchical, noting how members were expected not just to accept their leader's theories, but to internalize the tenets of his worldview. So too did Ernest Jones acknowledge that his mentor could be prone to coldness and rejection, recounting the case of Wilhelm Steckel, once the committee's de facto second-in-command, who would find himself summarily dismissed for the rather cryptic infraction that his psychological smell was not right. Excommunication in this vein remained an ever-present threat. Arguably the most high-profile was that of Alfred Adler, an Austrian psychologist and pioneering contributor in his own right, who broke from Freudian dogma to advocate a more socially grounded conception of psychoanalysis. For this heresy, he, like the similarly apostate voices of Wilhelm Reich, Rudolf von Urban, and Fritz Wittels, would be either marginalized from the society or expelled altogether. Yet the most telling and undoubtedly most tragic story belonged to Victor Pausk, whose suicide at the age of just 40 was precipitated, at least in part, by the withdrawal of Freud's patriarchal support. I confess that I do not really miss him, the analyst would write just weeks after learning of his colleague's death. I had long realized that he could be of no further service, indeed that he constituted a threat to the future. Scholars have long disputed the drivers behind this ruthlessness. Some, such as Frederick Crews, generally considered Freud's most virulent modern-day critic, have asserted it to be a function of the neurologist's own psychological makeup, deriding his subject as a satirizing self-dramatizer for whom advancing the fortunes of his movement was an imperative that overrode all others. More charitable interpretations have placed emphasis on cultural factors, specifically the tide of anti-Semitism rising throughout fin de siècle of Vienna, with Elizabeth Rudinescu noting, Freud cultivated the idea that being excluded as a Jew from the compact majority, he would be capable of preserving an independence of judgment that would enable him to defend himself more effectively against prejudices. The most conventional explanation for this well-documented absolutism, however, is that it was born of Freud's reflexive protectiveness toward the movement he had started, a movement still struggling to establish credibility among the empirically driven academics of the Habsburg Empire. Among those to adopt this reading was Paul Roazin, a political scientist turned historian of psychoanalysis, who portrayed the father of the field as a battling innovator whose warrior side has to be appreciated if we are to make any sense at all of his career in the round. Given Freud's lifelong affinity for Hannibal, a Semitic general who famously crossed the Alps to wage war with Rome, this is an assessment he likely would have shared. Behind the closed doors of their meetings, the chair of the Wednesday Psychological Society was far from reticent in expressing his desire to morally and intellectually overthrow Europe, while few could deny in his willingness to malign and often pathologize opposing viewpoints, a decidedly militaristic approach to leadership. These expulsions, after all, reflected more than just personal ruptures. As the self-appointed epicenter of the discipline, Freud's diktat spying not just the opinions of his coterie, but also those of publishing houses, training institutes, clinics, and editorial boards, ensuring the psychoanalysis, right from its inception, embodied less a legitimate area of study than more a vehicle for his own personal ambitions. Despite these authoritarian tendencies, few could dispute that Freud evoked, both as a man and a luminary, plenty of genuine, heartfelt devotion. Following a spirit of notable defections and fearing the movement might dissolve into factionalism, he set about convening Die Geheim Kommission, a secret and secretive cadre of his most faithful adherents. The function of this council was to discourage insubordination within the wider alliance, as well as to deal with more problematic elements. In effect, forming a bulwark between the group's informal yet uncontested president and its internal political strife. The Master, as he was semi-affectionately known, even went so far as to present these loyalists with matching palio rings, gifts which carried enormous symbolic weight, denoting as they did the recipient's commitment to Freudian doctrine. This doctrine, as previously described, was suffused with and built expressly upon a myriad of intrinsically Jewish suppositions. It would seem all but unfathomable that Freud failed to recognize these analogies. However, what pushes this beyond the limits of plausibility is that his unanimously Jewish entourage remained just as oblivious. With his focus on guilt, ritual, and moral introspection, Theodor Reich, one of Freud's earliest acolytes, and certainly his most Judeo-centric, often framed the exploration of the mind in terms starkly reminiscent of rabbinic tradition. His National Psychological Association for Psychoanalysis, continuing his mission of placing the study of selfhood within the Kabbalistic framework. Of a more political bent was Max Eichingen, the Russian-born son of a wealthy fur trader known as the Leipzig Rothschild. He played a crucial role in propagating Freudian maxims throughout Europe by way of his Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, the lifelong Zionist financially supporting his teacher for many years prior to his immigration to Palestine. From a strictly cultural standpoint, individuals such as Hans Sachs and Erich Fromm maintain that the field offered a secularized language through which Jewish values could be re-articulated in a period growing ever more hostile toward them, while the work of Melanie Klein is imbued with themes of internalized judgment, moral accountability, and symbolic thought, motifs explicitly aligned with Talmudic concerns over ethical development and the struggle for inner reconciliation. These were far from Freud's only followers to harbour such sympathies. Once more, it would require far more time than can here be justified to properly examine how the Jewishness of Isidor Sadjar, Edward Hitchman, and Siegfried Bernfeld, Herbert Silber, Felix Deutsch, and Paul Federn helped shape their lives and their intellectual outputs. Nevertheless, its prevalence alone must surely suggest that this Jewishness, whether of the cultural, political, or spiritual variety, was integral to one's capacity to grasp psychoanalysis. Freud himself would frequently espouse such sentiments, and yet, in spite of his prejudices, in spite even of the ethnically homogeneous atmosphere he fostered, It was to prove one of the few Gentiles within his discipleship who would be chosen to replace him as figurehead, Carl Jung. This was hardly a coincidence. Freud had long been keen that psychoanalysis shed its notoriety as a procally Jewish science, and so, in an effort to nullify these accusations, had deliberately sought out a successor who might engender trust throughout the German-speaking world. Jung seemed to fit the bill perfectly. A Swiss Protestant from a distinguished line of scholars and clergymen, the Jung took on was not just a brilliant thinker and engaging personality, but a clinician who had already garnered considerable acclaim within mainstream psychiatry. That is not to say Freud was without reservations. From the outset of the relationship, he had expressed concerns about Jung's alleged anti-Jewish biases, indeed his very ability as a non-Jew to fully understand and accept psychoanalysis itself. In its private correspondences, the avowed atheist would go so far as to dub his apprentice the man of God, a derisory allusion to Jung's outspoken interest in alchemy, astrology, and assorted strains of esotericism. On several occasions, he would even confess doubts over his crown prince's loyalty, once a banishable offence. But facing mounting charges of despotism and with his own health faltering, Freud would set aside these misgivings to appoint Jung president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, and by extension, heir to his intellectual legacy. Ostensibly, this appeared a radically new direction for the movement. Ever since first formalizing his ideas, Freud had gone to great lengths to paint psychoanalysis as scientifically grounded and unflinchingly rational, an image he risked by naming a replacement known among fellow practitioners as the mystic. Yet, for all Freud's outward disdain for Jung's psychospiritualism, the Kabbalistic concepts concealed within his own work were not just shared by his Gentile understudy, but indeed would prove significantly amplified. In perhaps his most celebrated thesis, Jung presented what he called archetypes, manifestations of the transpersonal reality imprinted onto the human psyche. These truisms, he contended, were continuously striving to break into awareness via myth, art and dreams, the proper interpretation of which would guide one towards individuation, the psychodynamic version of enlightenment. Not that he had achieved this revelation alone. Jung's archetypes, as with many of his theories, were but an extension of insights Freud had already laid down: psychic determinism and wish fulfillment, repression and dream analysis, insights which he in turn had derived from the Kabbalah. But while his predecessor had sought to obfuscate the origins of his thinking, Jung would acknowledge these quite openly. Writing to an admirer, he commented that in order to understand Freud's work, which is to say, the very rudiments of psychoanalysis, one would have to take a deep plunge into the history of the Jewish mind. This would carry us beyond Jewish orthodoxy into the subterranean workings of Hasidism, and then into the intricacies of the Kabbalah. In formulating his notion of synchronicity, the meaningful coincidences beyond cause and effect, Jung would do just that. His claim of a hidden order to the universe, all but indistinguishable from the Zohar's illustration of Sod. More obviously Kabbalah-inspired still is his exploration of the anima and the animus, the feminine Shekinah and masculine Hakadosh Baruch Hu aspects of the individual, which seek to be integrated in pursuit of psychological and spiritual wholeness. It might even be said that while Jung's stewardship of the Psychoanalytic Association superficially distracted from the organization's Jewishness on the purely theoretical level, he instead brought this much further to the fore. After Freud's efforts to obscure the metaphysical underpinnings of his work, Jung's tenure would see the field re-infused with cosmic significance and sense of the mind's place within the eternal, alongside methods clearly rooted in the rabbinic tradition. In this regard, there can be little doubt that his philosophy has supplanted Freud's. Although the father of psychoanalysis remains synonymous with institutionalized introspection, his legacy is nonetheless marked by a striking duality. At once lauded as a genius and secular prophet, and simultaneously dismissed as both a flawed man and thinker whose formerly canonical decrees have wilted under academic scrutiny, Jung's stature, on the other hand, only continues to grow. His development of analytical psychology, a far more holistic doctrine, recontextualized inner life as a landscape to be cultivated and tended to, rather than simply excavated, while so too did he contribute the still practical tools of word association and psychological types, the basis for the widely used Myers-Briggs test. From a broader societal perspective, Jung's ideas have also permeated far more profoundly than Freud's ever managed, filtering into popular discourse through music, marketing, media, art and cinema, as well as the rapidly burgeoning New Age movement. It is unsurprising then, for all its 120 years of maturation, the psychological establishment has yet to cast off its reputation as an innately Jewish science. The reasons for this seem self-evident. While official figures are difficult to come by, indeed conspicuously difficult to come by, it is clear that Jews, though far from the monolith they once were, still comprise an enormously outsized segment of the profession. In a list of the 99 leading psychologists of the 20th century, over 40% were Jewish. A similar study found that almost half of all citations in academic literature were made by Jews, a number even higher for introductory textbooks. The psychological division of the US National Academy of Sciences, currently boasting an almost 1-to-1 Jew to Gentile ratio. Most prominent clinical theories were codified by Jews. Within elite US universities, approximately 1/3 of psychology departments are Jewish, as are many of social media's best known mental health influencers. Jonathan Haidt, Steven Pinker, and Gabor Mate can name but a few. Some might even contest that far from escaping the anti-stigma, the discipline has actually embraced its status as a Jewish science. Freud's daughter Anna, addressing the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, declaring it nothing less than a title of honor. How this translates to a collective mental well-being is all but impossible to say. Though psychoanalysis and its subsequent offshoots might take themselves as beacons leading us out of the chaos of the subconscious. Looking around at the state of Western society, it would appear we are deeper in its clutches than ever. Anxiety has risen to epidemic proportions. Depression is now equally widespread. Grief, anger, loneliness and despair, once viewed as the normal fluctuations of emotional life, have today been reduced to a series of diagnosable disorders, while the all-consuming obsession with the self, manifested in carefully curated online personas and increasingly niche micro-identities, has led only to fragmentation, atomization, and the dissolution of the bonds we once shared. Whether Freud in his schoolworks ever envisaged this civilizational unraveling, it is all a matter of conjecture. Whether this was their unspoken goal remains even more speculative. What appears irrefutable, however, is that beneath their veneer of rationality and clinical detachment, what this secular priesthood was in fact upholding in unleashing their Jewish science upon the world was a philosophical tradition and metaphysical inheritance whose origins lie not in the early 20th century Vienna, but rather in the ancient mysticism of the Kabbalah.